November 8th, 1942. Somewhere along the Algerian coast, the Mediterranean sits black and cold and completely still. A German intelligence officer stationed at Oran writes a brief entry in his field diary that night. American landings have begun along the North African coast, he notes, almost dismissively. American units appear to be committing infantry directly to the beach assaults. He expects a slow, costly advance. He expects confusion. He expects, in short, exactly what every German officer had by this point in the war come to expect from Allied forces. He was not wrong about the confusion. He was catastrophically wrong about nearly everything else. Because moving through the darkness that same night, climbing down rope nets into heaving landing craft, were men who had been selected, tested, broken down, and rebuilt into something the Wehrmacht had not yet encountered in 3 years of fighting Americans, British, French, or anyone else. They wore the same uniform as any other GI. They carried the same weapons, but they had trained under British instructors in the mountains of Scotland, been pushed through exercises specifically designed to break men before they ever reached actual combat, and were commanded by a 31-year-old colonel named William Orlando Darby, who held an almost fanatical conviction that a small enough number of the right men could redefine what infantry was capable of on a modern battlefield. They called themselves Rangers, a name borrowed from the colonial American frontier, from the irregular fighters who had harassed British regulars through the dense forests of the New World nearly 2 centuries earlier. German intelligence did not know this history yet. Over the following 18 months, they would be forced to learn it the hard way, one shattered defensive position at a time. Within 72 hours of that first landing, German and Italian commanders were already sending urgent dispatches back to their own headquarters, describing an American unit operating in ways no existing training manual had prepared them to counter. What makes those dispatches genuinely remarkable, reading them today, is not that they praise the enemy. It is that they read, unmistakably, as frightened. This is not the story of one famous battle. It is the story of a unit created as an experiment, deployed before that experiment had finished proving itself, and discovered, in real combat, against a genuinely capable enemy, that nearly everything its training had promised actually worked. It is the story of what happened when the German army first met the 1st Ranger Battalion in the dark, and why the German soldiers who survived that meeting spent the rest of the war quietly hoping they would never meet the unit again. Consider what makes this specific case genuinely unusual among the countless small unit engagements of the Second World War. Most elite formations earn their reputation gradually, across years, through a slow accumulation of individual actions that historians only later assemble into a coherent narrative. The Rangers earned theirs inside a single week in November 1942, a formation barely 5 months old, still working through the rough edges of a training doctrine nobody had fully validated in live combat, thrown directly against a professional Continental Army with 3 years of hard-won battlefield experience already behind it. By any reasonable actuarial logic, the experiment should have failed, or at best produced a mixed, inconclusive result. Instead, it produced something closer to a live demonstration, proof, delivered in real time and under fire, that an entirely new category of infantry unit had just walked onto the European battlefield. To understand what the Rangers actually represented, you first have to understand what the American Army looked like in the months immediately before North Africa. The United States had been a combatant nation for less than a year. Pearl Harbor had come in December 1941. By the spring of 1942, the Army was enormous on paper and almost entirely untested in the specific kind of close, sustained infantry combat the Wehrmacht had been refining continuously since 1939. American soldiers were brave, reasonably well equipped, and genuinely motivated, but bravery and equipment do not, on their own, produce the cold, calculated lethality that only comes from years of doctrine refined against a real, adapting enemy. The British had already learned this lesson at brutal cost. They had been fighting since 1939, had been driven off the continent at Dunkirk, and had spent the intervening years raiding occupied Europe with commando units, refining, through repeated failure and occasional brilliant success, a specific philosophy of elite infantry operations built around speed, aggression, night movement, and a genuine willingness to operate in small groups deep inside enemy-held territory. When American forces entered the war, British commanders offered to share everything that costly experience had taught them. Major General Lucian Truscott was assigned to study British commando doctrine directly and determine whether an equivalent formation could be built for the U.S. Army. He chose the name Rangers deliberately, specifically to connect the new unit to something distinctly American, rather than to any existing European military tradition. Colonial-era Rangers had operated as scouts, raiders, and irregular fighters across terrain conventional armies simply could not follow them into, winning by being faster, harder, and more willing to take risks than their enemies had any reason to expect. Darby received command of the newly formed 1st Ranger Battalion in June 1942. He had graduated from West Point with no meaningful background in unconventional or special operations of any kind. What he brought instead proved, in the end, more valuable than direct experience. An almost fanatical belief that the men under his command could genuinely be trained to do things other soldiers simply could not. Recruitment itself was deliberately unusual by conventional Army standards. Rather than assigning men to the new unit through the ordinary chain of command, Darby's officers toured existing American units stationed in Northern Ireland specifically seeking volunteers, interviewing candidates individually, and rejecting a substantial majority of applicants before training had even formally begun. The selection criteria were, by Darby's own account, less concerned with prior physical fitness than with a specific willingness to volunteer for something explicitly described in advance as considerably more dangerous than standard infantry service. A self-selection process that, whatever its scientific merit, produced a battalion whose average member had already made one deliberate choice to accept greater risk before a single day of formal training had begun. He drove his battalion through a training program at Achnacarry Castle in Scotland, the same facility that had already forged British commando units, deliberately designed to exceed what most men could reasonably be expected to endure. Recruits ran the same stretch of rugged highland terrain repeatedly, under live machine gun fire deliberately set just high enough to keep men crawling rather than standing, forded freezing rivers in full kit, and scaled cliff faces at night that instructors themselves had personally tested for exactly how much margin for error an exhausted man actually retained after 18 hours without sleep. Men who could not complete it were quietly returned to conventional units without stigma. The men who remained were never supermen in any meaningful sense. They were simply men who had chosen, repeatedly, under sustained and genuinely extreme pressure, to stay. A German military analyst who later reviewed captured documents on the Rangers, in an assessment American interrogators would eventually recover, identified the specific thing that actually separated this unit from standard American infantry. It was not their weapons, it was not their equipment, and it was not, strictly speaking, even their tactics in the narrow technical sense. It was, in his own word, their psychology. Rangers had been trained to treat difficulty itself as the normal condition of operating, and to treat an enemy's own confidence in his own safety as a specific vulnerability to be deliberately exploited. This, the analyst concluded, was the single most dangerous thing about the entire unit. He was right, and the German army was about to discover exactly how right he had been, in engagement after engagement for the better part of 2 years. Arzu, Algeria, November 8, 1942, 0100 hours. The harbor sits heavily defended. The Vichy French garrison has artillery covering every reasonable approach, searchlights positioned to illuminate any seaborne assault, and fortifications designed by engineers who understood precisely what an attacking force would physically need to cross to reach them. By any conventional military assessment, this is a position demanding a sustained naval bombardment, followed by a full-scale infantry assault. a position that should take hours to reduce and cost real casualties in the process. The Rangers take it in minutes. 2 companies approach the harbor in complete silence, having stripped their own equipment of anything that might rattle or clink, having rehearsed the specific approach so many times in Scotland that the entire sequence of movements has become close to unconscious reflex. They cross the dark water in rubber boats, reach the seawall, and climb. No preparatory bombardment precedes them. No naval gunfire announces their arrival. They simply appear inside the defensive perimeter before anyone stationed there has had time to fully process that they are actually there. A Vichy French officer present that night later wrote in his own after-action report that he heard nothing before the Americans were already on the wall, that by the time any alarm was raised, the Rangers were already inside the battery compound itself, and that the sheer speed of the assault had rendered any organized defense functionally impossible before it could begin. The battery covering the northern approach falls in 11 minutes. A second battery falls 9 minutes after that. When the main body of the Allied landing force finally arrives expecting a contested harbor, they instead find it already secured, the Rangers having accomplished in roughly 20 minutes what the broader operational plan had allotted several hours to achieve. The specific tactical detail that gets lost in most later retellings of Arzu is how narrow the actual margin for failure had been. The rubber boats carrying the assault companies crossed roughly a mile of open water in total darkness with no illumination of any kind, navigating purely by compass bearing and a rehearsed count of paddle strokes, in a sea state calm enough to avoid swamping, but rough enough that a single miscounted stroke could have put an entire boat team 100 yards off its intended landing point, directly under a searchlight rather than safely past its arc. Nothing about the plan allowed for correction once the boats had actually launched. Success depended entirely on the accuracy of rehearsal conducted weeks earlier on a different beach, thousands of miles away. What genuinely troubled the German officers who studied this specific engagement afterward, though, was never simply the raw speed of it. It was the manner. The Rangers had moved through a defended position in total darkness and eliminated resistance with a precision that left almost no room for the kind of chaos an assault of this type should, by every reasonable expectation, have produced, and had done it without the overwhelming firepower American forces were already becoming closely associated with in German tactical assessments generally. German staff officers of this period had a standing phrase for the American approach to warfare more broadly: Materielschlacht, the Battle of Materiel, the working assumption that Americans won engagements primarily by burying an enemy under equipment, ammunition, and raw industrial output rather than through genuine tactical skill. What happened at Arzu simply did not fit that comfortable framework at all, and German intelligence officers, receiving the resulting reports from Oran, began, for the first time, to ask serious questions about exactly what kind of American unit they had just encountered. Between Arzu and the fighting that followed in Tunisia, Darby's men spent the intervening weeks quietly refining equipment nobody at Achnacarry had specifically issued them for. Standard issue boots were resoled with softer rubber to reduce the specific sound a hobnailed sole made against loose rock. Canteens were wrapped in cloth to stop them rattling against a belt buckle during a night approach. Grenades were taped to prevent the pin ring from catching on brush in the dark and detonating early. None of this appeared in any formal Army logistics manual of the period. It emerged instead from the specific, hard-won recognition that the margin separating a successful silent approach from a compromised one frequently came down to details no conventional infantry training had ever considered worth addressing. German intelligence officers studying captured Ranger equipment after the fact noted this modification pattern specifically, describing it in one recovered assessment as evidence of a unit that had internalized combat lessons faster than its own quartermaster corps could formally document them. Jebel El Ankh, Tunisia, March 1943. The North African campaign has grown considerably more serious by this point. German forces have reinforced Tunisia with genuinely experienced units, including elements of the Africa Corps that had been fighting continuously since 1941. The terrain here is brutal: rocky ridgelines, limited sight lines, ground that punishes any force attempting to cross it in daylight under observation. German defenders have established positions along the high ground they consider genuinely defensible, and have had real time to prepare them properly. wire laid, machine guns sighted with overlapping fields of fire, artillery pre-registered on every approach a rational attacker would be expected to use. Darby sends the Rangers up the ridge at night. The climb itself, according to accounts collected after the war, took close to 4 hours across loose scree and vertical rock face in total darkness, with each man carrying his own weapon, ammunition, and water with no possibility of resupply until the position was either taken or the attempt abandoned. Any single dislodged rock rolling down the slope risked alerting the German positions above before the climbing companies had reached striking distance. A German sergeant from the 167th Infantry Regiment, one of the position's survivors, later described the experience directly. Stationed in a forward observation post along the ridgeline, he had been awake for 4 continuous hours, watching the valley below for exactly this kind of approach. He saw nothing. He heard nothing. And then, in his own words, they were simply there. Not attacking, already there. The first thing he genuinely understood, he wrote, was that armed men were now behind him rather than in front of him, and that the position he had believed entirely secure had been rendered meaningless before a single shot was actually fired. The Rangers had scaled a cliff face German engineers had formally assessed as impassable and emerged directly on the unprotected far side of the entire defensive line. The assault that followed opened with knives and bayonets rather than rifles, specifically to preserve surprise for as long as physically possible. German defenders positioned and prepared for an attack arriving from below instead found themselves fighting men who had appeared from a direction their own engineers had confidently ruled out. The ridge fell before dawn. The German regimental commander who filed the formal after-action report for this specific engagement wrote something that would recur, in one variation or another, across German assessments of Ranger operations for the following 2 years. His men, he wrote, had not been defeated by superior numbers or superior firepower, but by a specific form of tactical aggression that rendered carefully prepared defensive positions essentially irrelevant on their own terms. The Americans, he continued, had treated an obstacle his own engineers had judged genuinely impossible as a viable route of advance instead. His superiors underlined and forwarded to Army Group Headquarters the sentence that closed his report. Units of this specific type, he concluded, required a fundamentally different defensive doctrine altogether, since they could not be reliably stopped by positions built on the standing assumption that an attacker would approach from a predictable direction. This is the specific moment German operational thinking began, in a documented and traceable way, to revise its working model of American infantry. Not all American infantry. These specific American soldiers. The ones who had just climbed the cliff nobody thought climbable. The Rangers were never, in any honest accounting, invincible, and the men who actually served in the unit would have been the first to reject that specific characterization outright. They were human beings trained to an extraordinary standard, operating repeatedly in conditions that killed men even when every single element of a given plan went exactly as intended. Private First Class James Altieri, who later documented his own wartime experience in detail, wrote at some length about what the training and the subsequent combat actually did to a man's underlying relationship with fear itself. Fear did not disappear, he wrote. It became something else entirely. It became information. You learned, over months of deliberate exposure to sustained difficulty, to read fear the way a navigator reads a compass, not as a reason to stop, but as raw data about exactly where the danger currently sat and how to move through it rather than away from it. The Germans they fought, he noted, always seemed genuinely surprised that the Rangers simply kept moving under sustained fire. From inside the actual experience, he added, it never particularly felt like courage in any dramatic sense. It felt, far more plainly, like the training working exactly as designed. Altieri described the specific mechanics of this training in more concrete terms elsewhere in his own account. Instructors at Aknakari deliberately introduced live ammunition into exercises well before recruits felt genuinely ready for it, not as a hazing ritual, but as a calculated method of decoupling the physical sensation of danger from the mental response of panic, on the theory that a man who had already survived genuine live fire under controlled conditions dozens of times arrived at actual combat with a nervous system that had already been recalibrated to treat the specific sound and proximity of gunfire as familiar rather than catastrophic. Whether or not the underlying theory was scientifically precise, the practical result, according to multiple surviving accounts, was measurable. Rangers reaching North Africa reported far less of the specific freezing response conventional infantry instructors of the period had come to expect from green troops experiencing sustained fire for the first time. This specific transformation is the exact phenomenon German after-action reports kept circling around without ever quite finding the precise language to name directly. German soldiers of this period were not cowards. The Wehrmacht had spent 3 continuous years proving that beyond any reasonable doubt. But they had been trained inside a doctrinal system that valued position and the methodically prepared defense above nearly everything else. They were trained to hold ground. The Rangers had been trained to take it quickly, from directions that made holding it meaningless. Staff Sergeant Carlo Contrera from Brooklyn, New York, who served with the 1st Ranger Battalion through North Africa and on into the Italian campaign, survived the war and gave a lengthy interview decades later reflecting on exactly this dynamic. The Germans, he said, were always waiting for the Rangers to behave like conventional soldiers, to wait patiently for artillery support before advancing, to move forward in disciplined lines, to stop cleanly at whatever obstacle presented itself. The Rangers, by contrast, had been trained specifically to treat every one of those standing German assumptions as an exploitable weakness in its own right. When they won, he said plainly, they won specifically by refusing to become what the enemy had already decided they would be. He added a detail in the same interview that rarely appears in more familiar accounts of the unit. German prisoners taken during the North African fighting, when questioned informally by their own captors about what had actually happened, frequently described the same specific sensation in almost identical language. Not confusion about Ranger tactics in the abstract, but a genuine inability to reconcile what they had just experienced with what their own training had told them to expect from any American unit at all. Chiunzi Pass, Italy, September 1943. The Allied invasion of the Italian mainland has begun. Rangers form part of the force landing near Salerno, and Darby's battalion receives a specific, clearly defined task: seize and hold the mountain passes directly above the coastal plain. The strategic logic is simple and unforgiving. If German forces can move artillery up into those passes, they can fire directly down onto the invasion beaches below, and the entire Salerno landing becomes untenable almost immediately. The passes have to be held, whatever that ultimately costs. The Rangers take Chiunzi Pass. What follows over the next 18 days is something considerably different from a rapid assault, and it reveals an entirely separate dimension of what Darby's training program had actually built. This was no longer the specific skill set Ochnacary had emphasized most, the sudden, silent, overwhelming strike measured in minutes. Holding ground for 18 consecutive days under repeated assault demanded something closer to its opposite: sustained discipline, rationed ammunition, and the specific psychological endurance required to keep functioning as an effective fighting force long after the initial adrenaline of a single decisive action had worn off entirely. The Rangers hold the pass against repeated, sustained German attempts to retake it. Genuinely outnumbered, operating at altitude in mountain terrain as the weather steadily turns cold and wet, with no armor of their own and nothing beyond their own mortars for organic fire support. The German forces specifically assigned to retake the position include elements of the 26th Panzer Division, armored infantry carrying a real, substantial firepower advantage over anything the Rangers could bring to bear in return. The Rangers hold anyway. A German battalion commander from the 26th Panzer, whose own unit conducted 3 separate assaults against the Ranger positions across the second week of September, later provided a genuinely detailed account of the engagement in a post-war military study. His infantry advanced up the approach to the pass in good order during the first assault, supported by mortar fire directed against positions his own reconnaissance had carefully mapped in advance. The Rangers allowed his men to close to within roughly 80 meters before opening fire at all, a decision that itself reflected a specific, deliberate fire discipline drilled repeatedly at Aknakari. Hold fire past the point most conventional infantry instructors would consider prudent, accepting the added risk of a closer engagement in exchange for the near certainty of a devastating opening volley once fire was finally opened. The volume and accuracy of that fire at such close range, he wrote, was unlike anything he had previously encountered from Allied infantry in 4 years of continuous combat. His unit took 30% casualties within the first 4 minutes of contact. His men fell back in reasonably good order, he noted, but the specific speed and lethality of the American defense had genuinely not been anticipated, despite explicit warnings to that effect already circulating in his own intelligence briefings before the attack began. He ordered a second assault 2 days later, approaching from an entirely different angle his own engineers had specifically assessed as offering superior cover. The Rangers, he wrote, with the flat, understated precision soldiers reserve specifically for describing catastrophic failure, were already positioned to cover that exact alternate approach as well, as though the Americans had somehow anticipated the alternate route before his own men had even selected it. In reality, according to accounts collected from Ranger veterans after the war, there was no clairvoyance involved at all. Simply a standing patrol rotation that continuously covered every plausible approach to the position, rather than concentrating solely on the single route a first assault had already tested. A basic defensive discipline the German commander's own doctrine had apparently not led him to expect from an American unit. German forces brought up additional artillery ahead of a third assault and conducted a full preparatory bombardment before advancing. The Rangers absorbed it inside their prepared positions, and when German infantry advanced afterward, the resulting American defensive fire was, in the commander's own specific words, essentially identical in volume and accuracy to the first 2 engagements. He could not, by his own admission, fully account for this. The bombardment, he wrote, should by any reasonable calculation have meaningfully degraded the defenders' capacity to respond at all. He closed his own account with the Senate subsequently quoted in more than one post-war military study of Ranger operations. Across 18 days of repeated attempts to retake the position, his battalion had inflicted what he characterized, with careful professional restraint, as moderate casualties on the Ranger force holding it. His own losses, by direct contrast, he described only as severe. In his own considered professional judgment, the Ranger unit holding Chiunzi Pass ranked among the most effective defensive infantry formations he had personally encountered across 4 years of combat spanning 3 separate theaters of war: France, Russia, and North Africa. 4 years, 3 theaters. This was not, by any measure, a man unfamiliar with capable enemies. Cisterna, Italy, January 30th, 1944. The Anzio campaign has begun, Allied forces landing behind the existing German line in a bold attempt to break the developing Italian stalemate open. The 1st and 3rd Ranger battalions, roughly 750 men combined, receive orders to infiltrate through German lines under cover of darkness and seize the town of Cisterna ahead of the main Allied advance. The plan requires them to move for miles through an irrigation canal network in total silence, maintaining complete noise discipline throughout, and emerge inside a German-held perimeter before their presence could plausibly be detected. What the planning had not accounted for was that German command had received advance warning, not specifically about the Rangers by name, but general warning that a significant American push was coming, and the Wehrmacht had already reinforced the sector accordingly. The specific canal system the Rangers moved through led directly into territory considerably more heavily held than anyone in Allied planning had realized. They emerged from the canals at dawn, having maintained close to flawless noise discipline through the entire preceding night, and found themselves already surrounded. What followed lasted for hours. The Rangers fought through an encirclement that should, by any conventional tactical logic, have concluded within minutes, and instead produced one of the most ferocious small-unit engagements of the entire Italian campaign. They could not break out. They were simply too few, and the German forces now surrounding them were too many. Of the 750 Rangers who had entered the canal system that night, fewer than 10% ultimately escaped. The remainder were killed or captured outright, a single morning's toll that essentially matched, in absolute numbers, everything the unit had lost across the previous 14 months of continuous combat in North Africa and Sicily combined. A German general whose own forces conducted the encirclement described the engagement afterward in his post-war memoir. His troops, he wrote, had expected to contain and capture a comparatively conventional American raiding party. What they actually encountered was something else entirely. The fighting inside the canals and across the surrounding fields ran far longer than any reasonable military assessment of the tactical situation would have predicted. Men who were fully surrounded, badly outnumbered, and facing no realistic possibility of relief, fought, in his own carefully unexaggerating description, with a ferocity that produced the most sustained and costly resistance his forces had encountered from a unit of comparable size across the entire war. His own casualty figures, he noted, were considerably higher than the disproportion in raw numbers should reasonably have produced. 2 of the Rangers' 3 original battalions ceased to exist as functioning combat formations in a single morning. A German sergeant present in the engagement's aftermath later described the mood among his own comrades in the hours that followed. They were quiet, he said. They had fought American soldiers before, had defeated American soldiers before, had taken American prisoners before, without particular difficulty. But the men they had just fought inside those canals had not behaved, in any recognizable sense, like men who understood themselves to be losing. Even at the very end, fully surrounded and with no possibility of relief remaining, they had kept attacking rather than simply surrendering. His own squad sergeant major, a veteran who had personally survived Stalingrad, told his men afterward that he had never, across the entire war, watched other soldiers die that hard. Cisterna would remain, for the rest of the war and for decades afterward in Ranger institutional memory, the single most costly morning the unit ever endured. Proof, in the darkest possible terms, that the same training built to exploit an enemy's blind spots offered no comparable protection once the Rangers themselves became the ones caught by surprise. The German army did eventually attempt to develop a genuine countermeasure to the specific pattern the Rangers had established across North Africa and Sicily. And the fact that this countermeasure arrived only after Cisterna, rather than after Arzu or Jebel el Ankh, says something meaningful in itself about how long institutional adaptation actually takes even against a clearly documented threat. Beginning in late 1943, several German divisions operating in Italy began instituting standing orders specifically addressing infiltration by small elite American units. Patrol schedules along ridgelines and canal approaches were deliberately randomized rather than run on a fixed rotation. Listening posts were pushed further forward of the main defensive line than standard doctrine called for, and unit commanders received explicit instruction to treat unusually quiet stretches of front as a potential warning sign rather than simply welcome respite. One surviving German divisional order from this period, recovered after the war, specifically cites the earlier Ranger actions by name as the basis for the revised procedure. Direct, documented evidence that an enemy division had rewritten its own standing defensive doctrine in explicit response to a single American battalion's accumulated reputation. This adaptation, when it finally arrived, was real and by several accounts genuinely effective at reducing the specific element of total surprise the Rangers had relied on so heavily in their earlier engagements. It also arrived roughly 14 months after the problem had first become undeniable, following 3 separate documented engagements in which German commanders had explicitly recommended exactly this kind of doctrinal revision to their own superiors. The delay reflects less a failure of German military competence in any narrow sense than the genuinely difficult structural problem any large hierarchical institution faces when a single small unit's success does not fit neatly into the existing categories its own planning process was built to process. A battalion is, by conventional military accounting, too small a formation to reasonably justify an army-wide doctrinal revision, right up until that same small formation has personally dismantled 3 separate prepared defensive positions using the identical underlying method, at which point the accumulated weight of evidence finally outpaces institutional inertia. By the time the German army had genuinely absorbed the lesson Arzu had first offered in November 1942, the war in Italy had less than 18 months left to run.
William Darby was killed on April 30th, 1945, 9 days before Germany's formal surrender, struck by German artillery shrapnel near the town of Torbole on the shore of Lake Garda in northern Italy. He was 34 years old. He was posthumously promoted to brigadier general on the same day he died. He had, by that point, spent nearly 3 uninterrupted years building, training, and personally leading a unit whose casualty rate across the war ran well above the army-wide infantry average, a fact he was reportedly aware of, and never once used as grounds to soften the training pipeline that produced it. Carlo Contrera learned the news secondhand, from another veteran at a replacement depot near Naples. He said, decades later, that he simply sat down when he heard it. What he found himself thinking about in that moment was not any specific battle or any single decisive moment of combat. He kept thinking instead about the training itself, about Scotland, about the exercises conducted in the dark and the cold, about what it had actually felt like to become something genuinely different from the man each of them had been before they arrived at Achnacarry. Darby, he said, had never made his men fearless, a common misunderstanding among people who had not personally lived through the training. What Darby had actually done was teach them that fear functioned as information rather than as permission to stop. The real difference between Rangers and other soldiers, in Contrera's own final formulation, was never that Rangers felt no fear. It was that Rangers had been trained, across months of sustained and entirely deliberate difficulty, to treat fear the exact way a navigator treats a compass, not as a reason to stop moving, but as data about which direction to move through next. In the cemeteries scattered across North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, beneath ground marked with place names that appear in comparatively few popular American histories of the war, lie the men who learned this specific lesson and then proved it, repeatedly, in the field. They proved it in total darkness, against genuinely prepared positions, across terrain their own defenders had confidently judged impossible to approach from. They proved it against one of the most professionally capable armies in modern history, an army that acknowledged, in its own internal operational documents, that these particular Americans represented something it had not previously encountered and did not yet have a reliable doctrine to counter. The 1st Ranger Battalion's specific institutional legacy outlasted the individual unit itself by decades.
The training principles Darby developed, largely by trial and error at Achnacarry, live-fire desensitization, deliberate self-selection through voluntary risk, and explicit doctrinal preference for attacking from a direction the defender has already ruled out, became, in modified and considerably more formalized versions, foundational elements of the training pipelines that would eventually produce the modern U.S. Army Rangers, Special Forces, and, more distantly, the broader post-1945 American Special Operations community as a whole. None of this was obvious or guaranteed at the time. In 1942, the entire concept remained an unproven experiment resting on one colonel's personal conviction and a training program nobody outside Scotland had ever formally validated against a serious continental army. It became, within roughly 18 months and across 4 documented engagements, something closer to a permanent addition to how the United States military understood the outer limits of what a sufficiently well-trained infantry unit could actually accomplish. German military historians studying Ranger operations in the decades following the war settled on a phrase for the underlying pattern: the Ranger Principle. The systematic exploitation of the gap separating what a defender believes is possible from what an attacker is actually willing to attempt. It is genuinely difficult, as more than one of these historians has noted, to build a reliable defense against an enemy who has learned to live comfortably inside the space you had already convinced yourself was empty. The specific German intelligence analyst who had first identified the Ranger psychology early in the North African campaign, who had written that they had been trained to treat difficulty as normal and an enemy's own confidence in his safety as a weapon to be deliberately turned against him, was himself captured in Tunisia in May 1943. American interrogators eventually asked him directly what he made of the unit. The most dangerous infantry force he had encountered in the entire war, he answered without particular hesitation. Asked why, he offered an explanation that has since been quoted in more than one post-war study of unconventional infantry tactics. Most soldiers, he said, reaching a wall, look immediately for a gate. The Rangers had been trained instead to look first for a way over the wall. He paused before adding one final observation that was not, in any conventional sense, a military assessment at all. The genuinely dangerous thing about the Rangers, he said, was never really the climbing itself. It was that they had somehow been trained to find the climbing normal. That final distinction between a unit capable of an extraordinary act and a unit that had genuinely internalized the extraordinary as its own baseline expectation is, in the end, the actual subject of this account. Any sufficiently motivated group of soldiers can be ordered to attempt something difficult once, under the pressure of a single decisive night. What separated the 1st Ranger Battalion from nearly every other infantry formation the Wehrmacht encountered across the war was that difficulty itself had stopped registering, inside the unit's own collective psychology, as unusual at all. Arzu, Jebel el Ankh, Chiunzi, and Cisterna were 4 separate expressions of the identical training principle, applied against 4 entirely different tactical problems, by men who had been taught, months earlier and thousands of miles away in the cold of a Scottish training ground, that the obstacle in front of them was never really the thing standing in their way. Their own assumption about it was. Nothing about this specific lesson expired with the war itself. The precise doctrinal language changed across the following decades. Akhnakeri's live-fire desensitization drills would eventually be formalized, refined, and repeatedly revised by successive generations of American Special Operations instructors who had never personally met Darby and, in many cases, had not yet been born when he died near Torbole. But the underlying insight his battalion first demonstrated, under fire, in the dark, on a North African beach in November 1942, remained essentially unchanged. An enemy's confidence in the boundaries of the possible is itself a specific, exploitable vulnerability, available to any force disciplined enough to actually train for the space just beyond it. The German officers who studied the Rangers understood this. It is, in the end, the entire reason their own reports read, across every single engagement this account has traced, as something considerably closer to fear than to simple professional respect.